So one of the things I want to share with you is, why are these outreach programs needed? Well, I can tell you I've been doing this job now for about 20 years or so, and some of the things that I'm seeing are that the victims are younger ages, whereas when I first started, being a medical examiner, I would see, overdoses and drug abuses, deaths related to that, usually would be people in maybe their 30s or 40s, something like that. And I've definitely seen a trend toward now where the average age is actually in the low to mid 20s. The other thing that we're seeing something that we call polypharmacy. Okay, that's just a fancy name for, instead of one drug being in a person's system, we're seeing multiple drugs being in a person's system, and I'm going to show you some examples of that. And the typical history, as you see, is you have exposure to drugs at a young age, and despite the attempts at counseling and rehabilitation, by the time they come to our office, you know what the result is. And that's why you've heard a couple of things today. One of the themes I do want to share is prevention, and that's why the most important thing is to have young people here and their parents, because by the time we're trying to work with number 3 there with counseling and rehabilitation, your brain chemistry has already been altered, okay? And that's really what we're trying to prevent. All right, so I just want to define a couple of things. So when we talk about opioids, what we're talking about is any of these drugs that bind to certain receptors in the brain, okay? And an opioids can be an opiate, which is, that's derived naturally from the poppy seed, and that would be things like morphine and codeine. We have semi-synthetic opioids, which take morphine and then chemically turn it into something else. That's what heroin is, basically. That's a semi-synthetic opioid. And you see some other examples there of semi-synthetic opioids like oxycodone, oxymorphone. Synthetic opioids are not chemically related to opiates, but they bind to the same receptors in the brain. And that's, of all the ones, the one that's clearly getting the most attention these days is fentanyl. And that's been a major problem in our office, as I'm going to share with you. So all of these things, whether opiates or opioids, they all have the same effect on the body, which is to depress the breathing centers in the brain, and that's really where the basis of the problem comes. So I want to share with you a couple of facts here. And you've seen some of these already tonight, but if you look at between 2000 and 2014, we've had this really major increase in drug overdose deaths, and especially between 2013 and 2014. You can see in 2014, there were almost 50,000 deaths due to drug overdoses, and in that same year, 60% of them were of opioid-related drugs. Now, if we look specifically at the kinds of opioids, okay, what I'm trying to show you here is that the natural or the semi-synthetic opioids, okay, morphine and codeine and oxycodone, things like that, there was about a 10% increase between 2013 and 2014. If you look at heroin, that increased 26%. But fentanyl, okay, the synthetic opioids, increased 80%. All right? And stated another way, more people died in 2014 in the United States from drug overdoses than any other year on record. And as a matter of fact, there were 1.5 times as many deaths from drug overdoses as there were from motor vehicle crashes. Okay? The heroin overdoses tripled over the 4 years. We've heard many times, right, we talk about the gateways, okay? And clearly, in terms of gateway, it's been shown that the strongest risk factor for heroin initiation and use is past misuse of prescription opioids, okay? And this can come up as innocently as somebody, you know, your child may have a dental procedure or may have a sports-related injury. It may come from a completely, you know, legal prescription opioid drug, okay? But that clearly has been shown to be one of the gateways of this problem. The other issues are that heroin is now, it's cheaper, it's easier to get a hold of, okay, and it's more pure, okay? So the effect on the body is the potency is greater. So when we talk about these gateways, okay, you've heard them all tonight: alcohol, marijuana, prescription drug leading to heroin, and just some statistics. So somebody who tries alcohol twice as more likely to try heroin, just on statistics alone. Somebody who tries marijuana, 3 times more likely to try heroin, just on statistics alone. Okay? Somebody who misuses or abuses prescription drugs, misuses means that you take a dose that's other than what's prescribed, even if it's for a legitimate indication. Abuse is when you're using the drug not for the indication that it was prescribed, or you're not prescribed it at all. They're 40 times more likely to use heroin. Now let's talk about fentanyl, because as scary as heroin is, fentanyl is worse, okay? Why? Because first of all, if we take opiates and look at their potency by dose, okay, if morphine, which is derived directly from the poppy plant, is the standard, that's at 1, we'll give that an arbitrary figure of a potency of 1, heroin has a potency of 2, twice as strong as morphine. It's actually converted to morphine. Well, fentanyl is 50 times the dose strong as strong as heroin, and 100 times as strong as morphine for the same exact dose, okay? And not only is it so strong, but it's also very, very fast acting. So you've heard, I'm sure people out here have heard of Narcan or naloxone. Well, naloxone has a reasonable chance to work on heroin overdoses, but on fentanyl, because it's so potent and because it's so fast acting, it's that much more difficult for it to have an effect. Another issue is that it's difficult now to track fentanyl-related deaths, because not all laboratories have the ability to detect it. Fortunately, our lab does. And it turns out that these fentanyl overdoses, it's interesting. Fentanyl started out as a drug that was made in a synthetic lab in the late 50s. It started out really as an analgesic that was used by anesthesiologists and dentists. So it started out as really a medical, an indicated prescription drug. Now it's manufactured illicitly in labs, and there's actually, because of the process by which it's made, we have the ability to identify some of those. But there have been now epidemics in all different parts of the country with fentanyl. And now in our part of the country where we're affected, but we've seen epidemics in the Midwest, in the West, Mideast, and here. Okay, so I want to just show you again with some of the statistics directly from Suffolk County. I want to just use some explanatory notes here. So I'm going to show you some statistics. So when we talk about total opioid deaths, okay, that's all deaths in which either a single or multiple opioids, with or without other class of drugs, cause death, okay? Deaths including a drug means that that drug either caused or contributed to the death, okay? And then sometimes cases may be represented in more than one cell, as I'll show you, so the sum of the individual cells may not add up to the total, okay? So, and I do apologize, I know this is a kind of a filled slide here, but basically what I'm trying to show you is if you look from 2010 to 2016, you see the total opioid deaths from 2010 on. 2016 has an asterisk because we don't have all the data, obviously, yet from 2016. So really look from 2010 to 2015, and first of all, you can see that there's been an almost doubling of the total opioid deaths, okay? If you look at the ones including heroin, all right, goes from 37 up to 156 in 2015, almost a 4-time increase. The deaths including fentanyl goes from 11 up to 84, and in 2016, we already have more than our total in 2015, okay? And then if you look at fentanyl and heroin, okay, you can see going from, single digits, right, to up to 45, and already we have 28 this year. Now, one thing you see a decline in is oxycodone, okay, because again, that's the prescription opioids. Now, because heroin, cheaper, more pure, easier to obtain, we see that trend now gradually away from the prescription opioid analgesics to heroin, okay? And also, don't forget, and you heard this point, don't forget the fact that cocaine is still a problem, an issue, and is alcohol. And again, they're not mutually exclusive. People will mix drugs, opioids, ethanol, cocaine, or all together. Okay, so this is now just looking at Suffolk County alone, okay? And so Suffolk County, okay, if we look in 2015, all right, remember I talked about the polypharmacy, right? So 70 cases had a single drug that caused that person's death. Okay? 87 cases had 2 drugs that caused that person's death. 54 had 3 drugs, 10 had 4 drugs, 1 had 5 drugs, so a total of 224. But at one time, and again, I realize I just have this 2015 to show you, but at one time, 90% or more would be of deaths would be 1 or 2 drugs. And so polypharmacy is definitely, something that we're seeing. So examples of some of the single drug fatalities: heroin, oxycodone, cocaine, methadone. Those are all single drug fatalities, okay? Now you see some examples of where we had 2 drugs or 3 drugs. Okay? Here we have some where we have 4. Okay, fentanyl, hydrocodone. Sometimes we have several opioids, okay? And then you see one where we have 5 different drugs. All right, and then the last statistics I'm going to show you before some pictures is that, and this is some of the good news, okay, is that now we have over 1,300 sworn officers who have been trained to recognize opioid overdoses and to use naloxone. Okay, the Suffolk County Police Department now responds to greater than 1 overdose per precinct per day. Okay, since mid-2012, we've had over 500 opioid-related reversals with Narcan. Okay, and the Ugly Truth program, which is our community outreach program, now has been presented to over 1,200 people and supplied over 1,000 Narcan kits. And actually, this data is dated now. Okay, this is from the beginning of the summer. All right. Okay. So what I want to share with you now is some of the things that we see from the medical examiner's office. Okay. All right. So why do we investigate these deaths? We investigate these deaths because drug overdoses are an injury, okay? They're a chemical injury, okay? So you're all familiar with injuries such as blunt force and sharp force injuries and gunshot wounds, okay? Well, drug intoxications are chemical injuries. So by law, we have to investigate and certify any death that could be related to a chemical injury, okay? So some of the scene findings that we see or that leads us to suspect that somebody may be using drugs or have a death related to drug abuse. Could be somebody on methadone maintenance, okay, for previous intravenous drug abuse. Paraphernalia, I'm going to show you what that looks like. Somebody who has prescriptions in other people's names. Pills that are stored in containers that are not legitimate prescription vials or mixtures of pills. Injection sites and transdermal patches, again, that are in unusual places. Okay? So I'm going to show you some of the images, all right, that we see in the medical examiner's office, okay? This is not for shock value. This is not, for anything like that. It's really just to give you the reality of the kind of things that we see. Okay? Here was a scene of a 19-year-old boy, okay, who died, who had a total of 6 different drugs in his system. Here's a question for you. How many of those drugs do you think were actually prescribed to him? Any thoughts? Not a single one. Those were medications he lived with his parents, aunt and uncle, and grandparents. They were all prescribed to his relatives, okay? And they were a combination of, prescription opioid drugs, painkillers, tranquilizers, and mixtures of all of those. Okay? Now, what I'm showing you here is this is the drug paraphernalia. This is what we sometimes will call the works. Okay? And so, just so that you can be familiar with this, when somebody injects intravenous drugs, what they do is they take that drug mixture and they suspend it in water, either in a spoon, okay, or a bottle cap, and that's called a cooker. They're going to heat that up, okay, to dissolve the drug, and then they put a filter in that cooker to remove any of the particulate impurities, okay? And then that's drawn into a syringe. So what you're seeing there is you see the spoon, right? You see the drug. The most common filter is a cigarette, okay? Although sometimes people will use the tongues of their shoes or other things. And the other thing you're seeing is the glassine envelope, which is where the drug is usually packaged. Okay? So can anybody tell me, you're seeing right here a picture, this is from an actual scene, what elements of what I showed you just here, what do you see? What elements of the works do you see in this picture? Okay, we see the spoon, right? Okay. Do we see, anybody see a filter? Yeah, we see, right? We see the cigarette. Okay, where's, right. Okay? That's right. And the syringe is in his hand. And so those are all the elements that we're seeing. And sometimes people will use, from any source they can. And one of the more common sources, for example, of water is people will use in public bathrooms. They'll actually use the toilet water as a source. Okay? All right. Does anybody see any marks on this person's arm? Yeah, pretty hard to see though. So one of the things that we always do in the course of an autopsy is if a person has what looks like a puncture wound on their arm and we're not sure, we'll actually make an incision into that. Okay? And that's what we see. Okay, that's the vein, that's the hemorrhage in the vein in between the arm. And if you think this is disturbing, it does get worse. Okay? This is somebody who's been using intravenous drugs for a long time. These are called track marks. So these are the scars that result from repeated use of a vein, and then that vein becomes scarred and infected, and it looks like that. And then what do you think happens after even a longer period of time is that's in the groin, and now that vein is completely scarred down, so you can't use it anymore to inject drugs, okay? So then what do people do? Well, then they don't have a choice. They've used the veins that are available. Then they may have to inject directly into the muscle, and that's called skin popping, okay? Another thing that people will do sometimes is they'll have tattoos like this to obscure puncture sites. That's an example of a skin popping there. Now that's a relatively clean one. That's scarred. Here's one where you have multiple skin popping sites that are starting to form ulcers. Okay? And then you can imagine if these ulcers became badly infected, you might get something that looks like this. Okay? All right. Now, another thing that can happen, I'm showing you a picture of the heart. Now, this is an actual very normal heart here. Okay? This was the heart of a young person who died in a motor vehicle crash and had head injuries. What I'm showing you, that's a normal tricuspid valve. That's in the right ventricle of the heart. And so what I'm showing you here is that another risk that intravenous drug users have is that when they inject drugs, there may be contaminants or impurities from that and cause bacteria to also enter the bloodstream, okay? Well, where does that blood go? It goes from the veins into the right side of the heart, and into the lungs. Okay? So that's a normal tricuspid valve on its way, the blood is on the way to the lungs. That's the tricuspid valve of an intravenous drug user where you see vegetations from bacteria causing an endocarditis, okay? So when those vegetations break off in the heart, okay, they can go, if it's on the right side, they can go into the lungs. If it's on the left side, it may go up into the brain and cause strokes. It may go into the kidneys, cause kidney failure. It may go down to the legs and cause necrosis of one of the digits, which would lead to an amputation. That's an aortic valve on the other side of somebody who used intravenous drugs. Okay, now that's a normal liver there. When I say normal, I mean it's an injured liver, but that's what a normal liver looks like. It's dark brown, somebody in a motor vehicle accident. Okay, that's the liver of somebody who was a chronic intravenous drug user who developed hepatitis B and C. And what happened is that liver became scarred and tried to make nodules, okay, to regenerate itself. And that's what we see in a situation of chronic intravenous drug abuse. That's a normal cut surface of a liver. That's what a cirrhotic liver looks like. So those are all chronic effects of drug abuse. All right? Now, right here, this is what we see most commonly at the scene of somebody who's overdosed on drugs, especially opioids, okay? We have a fancy name for that. We call that pulmonary edema, okay? And basically what that is that's the fluid in the lungs because these drugs make the lungs very leaky and they cause fluid to come out. Now, this is not just specific for drug abuse. We may see this in a drowning. We may see this in severe heart failure, but clearly, most commonly, we're seeing that now in the setting of intravenous drug abuse, especially opioids. Okay? That's what we would see at the autopsy table, fluid in the lungs. And that's a close-up picture right there. Okay? Another thing that happens is this is a normal brain. You can see that you can see the convolutions we call the gyri, and then the depths are the sulci, the hills and valleys in the brain. Well, what do you think happens to the brain when you have an opioid overdose, okay, and now you're not breathing anymore, and now you're starting to get irreversible brain damage? Well, what the brain does is that it swells, okay? So the next picture I'm going to show you is that of a swollen brain in somebody who survived for a few weeks after a fatal opioid overdose. Look at the difference, right? You can't see those hills and valleys anymore. It's just a completely flattened brain. So, yeah, we were able to, that person could be resuscitated, but basically ended up in a vegetative state because they had suffered irreversible brain damage. Okay, couple other things. Now, we don't see this as commonly anymore, okay? If you look real closely, can anybody see the letters that are on those pills? Probably not a fair question. It says OC40. So these are the OxyContin ghost pills, okay? These had oxycodone in them, and then they dissolved, get into the bloodstream, but those are the receptacles in which they were packaged, and we recovered those from the stomach. But that's something that we used to see much more commonly when prescription, opioid analgesics were more common. And then this right here, this was actually a cocaine user, okay, who in an attempt to escape detection by the police actually tried to swallow the bag of crack cocaine, but it ended up in his airway. So he actually died from mechanical asphyxia or choked on this, as well as having cocaine in his system. Okay? Now, the last thing I want to talk about briefly, because again, this is certainly a problem that you need to be aware of, are the synthetic cannabinoids, okay? Have different names, right? K2 or spice. Spice is the European name. K2 is the name that we know more commonly in this country. You may see they have these fancy green labeling. It may say not for human consumption or incense. And So basically what these synthetic cannabinoids are, they're a growing number of, they're actually man-made chemicals. And so, there were actually some chemists from different parts of the country that have made these. They're sprayed on dried plant material, okay? And they may be vaporized to get high. Sometimes they're called synthetic marijuana or fake weed, but they're actually not even chemically related to marijuana. It's just that they act on the same receptors in the brain, but they actually have effects that are far more alarming than what we see with marijuana itself. Okay? Turns out that the only parts that are natural in these, okay, are the dried plant materials. And these effects can be unpredictable. They can even be potentially life-threatening. Okay? Now, some of the effects are similar to what we see with marijuana. Okay? They can enhance your mood. They may relax you. They may alter your perception. But they can also cause, frankly, psychotic symptoms. Okay? And so you may have anything from your heart rate going up to intense vomiting, violent behavior, suicidal or homicidal thoughts. Okay? They can be addictive. Okay? They can be smoked in joints or pipes, but sometimes they're made into a tea. Now, here's the thing that's scariest of all. 5 of these have been termed Schedule I controlled substances. But there are hundreds, and that's probably an underestimate now. There are probably thousands of these that are made that we don't have the ability in labs, or no other labs have the ability to actually detect these substances. But this is a real problem. And so, all I can do is make you aware of it. And really, the evidence for this, even in Suffolk County, is that we have some deaths in which, teenagers were observed to be acting, like they were stoned, like they were high, and then they have the pulmonary edema, and then we do a complete autopsy, but we can't detect a drug in our routine toxicology screen. Okay? Even when we've sent those out to reference labs that have the ability to detect these, have not always been able to find what's going on. So, these are the kind of cases where, we hold on to the samples hoping that at some time we'll have the ability to identify these substances. Okay? So really what I wanted to do tonight was just give you a perspective of what I see in the medical examiner's office, to give you some statistics but not overload you, and then to show you some pictures in terms of what I see. And really I guess to summarize this is, what we do, you don't need me to tell you this. What we do is a sad job. So the way that we try to turn this around is to try to use the information that we see in the medical examiner's office, to support, people that are alive, okay? We have a phrase in the medical examiner's office, this is where death delights to serve the living. Now, delights is clearly an exaggeration, but that's the idea, is that if we can use what we see, to help, that's what we're trying to do. And then the last thing I want to end with is that, I do autopsies on people, who've lived a full life, okay? And I can tell that from their organs, right? Their scarred organs. I can say, well, at least they've lived a full life. The saddest thing for me is when I do an autopsy on young people who have, really pristine organs, and I'm looking at them and saying, you shouldn't be here, but they're dead in the autopsy room. I want to thank you very much for your attention.